Quentin Tarantino recently said something very interesting in an interview where he was talking about his book, Cinema Speculation, which was a book that had essays regarding 13 films that he watched growing up in the 1970s. And he said that by writing this book, he had a new sense of respect for movie critics. He said that movie critics, unlike novelists or screenplay writers, have the unique challenge in that they can't write about whatever they feel like writing about, but rather they have a subject material. And sometimes, if you're a professional, you have this subject material every single week. Challenge that Tarantino overcame by writing autobiographically, by allowing himself, the writer, to sit between the lines, as he says, to allow his personality, his values, his perspective, his life story to sit as the underlying story that you're reading in these essays. And ultimately, this is why we love the critics that we love and why we keep going back to them to hear their latest take. But the reason I mention this here is because I think this insight is a much broader one that applies not just to the work of critics, but to any creative. That basically the most compelling work, the creative work that we're drawn to over and over again, is the one that carries emotional resonance. That's the thing that connects us to the work. And this is backed up by neuroscience too. Dr. Wendy Suzuki from NYU University speaks of the fact that there are 4 keys to memory, which include repetition, association, novelty, but most importantly for us creatives, emotional resonance. And this is the topic that I want to speak about today. And the core idea here is that what moves us emotionally is what we remember. It's what we're connected to. It's what makes work have impact. And upon meditating on this idea, I realized there are 3 ways in which you can make your work connect more emotionally. Firstly, here I want to examine a story I learned from reading 50 Cent's autobiography. 50 Cent you will know as the rapper, but he later became a TV producer. And the reason for this is that as he got older, when he tried to re-enter the hip-hop scene, he realized there was a bit of a disconnect between the things he would rap about and the audience that was still listening to him. Those early fans that he had built when he was younger were no longer the same people. They weren't the people who were in the clubs listening to In the Club. They were now at home. They were parents. They had young children. They had different lives to the ones they had when 50 Cent was first rapping. So he realized he had to enter a different medium if he wanted to still resonate emotionally with his audience. And that's where the insight for us here is to really know your audience. 50 Cent thought about what is it that his audience were lamenting or thinking about or worried about. These were the ideas, of course, that he needed to connect with. And he realized that probably a lot of the sort of anxieties and fears that these people were facing were really apt for something like TV, late night TV, in fact, the sort of thing they would stay up late to watch. And this is where he created the show Power, a show that explored a marriage breaking apart or friendships that were facing a sense of betrayal or distrust, even the relationship between a son and a father. These were dynamics that they were exploring in this show. But what was genius is that 50 Cent actually added another kind of emotional layer because he leveraged nostalgia in that he actually made sure that these themes were set across the backdrop of nightclubs, drugs, and violence, the sort of things that maybe to an extent his fan base were more accustomed to when they were younger, and the sort of thing that they wanted to experience again, but obviously from the safety of their own home. And so it's this combination of the sort of themes that people were likely, encountering and the drama that was important to them now that they were older, whilst also tapping into a bit of that nostalgia that came from being able to be back in the club again, but now from the safety and comfort of their own home. And so it's this combination, this 2-layered approach, which really came first from the insight of knowing your audience, knowing who you're actually creating your work for in order to target and layer in the emotionality that's really important for that particular audience. That's what 50 Cent figured out. And it reminds me of a quote from when I was reading Christopher Nolan's biography, where he noted that a director's job is to be in sync with the audience. This is exactly what that looks like. That's what 50 Cent was doing as a TV producer. And all of this reminds me of an insight I took from reading the book Mirror Makers, which is a book that documents the lives of those who we consider now to be the kind of godfathers of modern advertising, where the people who are most effective were really the ones who are making the mirrors, the people who are shining the mirrors back to people to reveal to them their fears, anxieties, but also their desires. But what if you don't know who your audience is yet, or you haven't located a fan base like 50 Cent did? Well, this is where I might recommend we look at something like comedy, something that often also at its peak, at its greatness, does a sort of two-layered approach that Power did, the TV show that 50 Cent created. And this is something I only thought about recently because I was watching the interview with Dan Houser, who was the co-creator of Rockstar Games, the game company that was producing games like GTA or Red Dead Redemption, and he was really the lead writer for it. And the interview was with Lex Friedman, and Lex Friedman asks him about what makes a great comedy. And this is where he notes, Dan Houser notes, that his favorite comedy, or one of the greatest TV shows in his mind, was that of The Office. And The Office is a great example of something that plays on this duality of this two-layered approach to emotionality, that if you want to have emotional resonance and impact, you actually need to contrast emotions. For example, The Office contrasts that of kind of cringe with that of sentimentality. Contrasting cynicism with sentimentality creates this really interesting effect where you'll find yourself going from crying at one point of laughter to then crying of sadness. And even the show, I remember, had this turn at one point where the character of Michael Scott really started to be a bit more of an empathetic character. I think really to lean into this sense of duality, but also to have longevity, in that we needed the main character to have some emotional resonance, and the show responded to that. So this is where I would look at this idea of contrast. I think this idea is not a recent one. The Office did not create it. In fact, when it comes to comedies, the silent era inventor of this has got to be that of Charlie Chaplin, someone who, although he was great at the comedic gags, the physical comedy, creating scenarios, he was really the best at it. He also, I remember reading in his autobiography that there was a scene or a moment where he was having to act out and perform a person who wanted to keep their job, to not be fired. And it's in pleading with his boss that he ends up, acting out the fact that he's got a family, the fact that he's got people to provide for. And during this performance, there was actually another actress who was kind of off stage watching this all happen, and she starts to cry. And, Chaplin actually approached her afterwards and say, "You okay? And why are you crying?" And it's where she notes, "I'm really sorry. This is meant to be a comedy, but I can't help but weep. You just make me sad." And this is where Chaplin had that insight, the initial insight, that actually comedy could be so much more than the single tone emotion of laughter. And so the insight here is for us to find the way in which we can contrast that which we want to accentuate. The interior designer Ilsa Crawford, someone who I've followed the career of, she talks about how contrast is extremely important in interior design, that we as humans don't really understand materials like marble unless they're contrasted with something like wood, that things like rough and smooth allow you to understand one and the other, that if you're in a place where everything is loud, everything is shouting at you, then nothing stands out. Everything kind of just becomes a wash, a blur. So for anything that we create, emotionality also needs a kind of duality, a contrast that allows us to really resonate and connect with the emotions that we want our audiences to connect with. But the third method is to look at the fact that, well, sometimes we don't know our audience like 50 Cent did, and other times we don't necessarily know the two things that we want to contrast yet in our work. And so how else can we create a kind of emotional resonance? Well, this is where I would look to documenting something that you authentically love. A great example of this is that when I was studying the work of Al Pacino, I realized that probably his greatest work really came from his directing. We obviously think of him as an actor, but he actually directed a documentary film called Looking for Richard. And it's this very unique documentary in that it has him at parts acting out the play Richard III, but most of the documentary shows him trying to understand what Richard III is even about, and in doing so, trying to better understand the mind and the work of Shakespeare. Of course, over the years, he performed Richard III numerous times in theatres, but he had this connection with Shakespeare throughout his life when, first reading Shakespeare and connecting to the power of words that he felt was just not a sentiment shared across with most actors. And most of the problem there was that he felt that Shakespeare was just too inaccessible. But if someone could sit and just try to understand and show the process of understanding a play like Richard III, a play that's extremely popular, and yet many would just attest to the fact that they didn't really know what the play was about, then he would help people actually connect with Shakespeare. And this was all done through the emotion of watching Al Pacino passionately talk and explore the concepts in Richard III. I have to even say that myself, I studied Shakespeare when I was at school, and yet it wasn't until this film, until watching this film, that I really felt emotionally connected. And I felt like I really understood how Shakespeare worked. I'm fascinated by the play Richard III now. Another person that comes to mind who did something similar was the music producer Rick Rubin, a legend in the hip-hop scene. In fact, when he first hit the scene, you didn't have the kind of grounds, the fertile grounds that someone like 50 Cent could actually manifest his work in. No, instead, hip-hop was still an underground scene. It was still only found in clubs in New York, which is where Rick Rubin would actually frequent, and he would go there and listen to the energy and the pure passion that was really bringing hip-hop to life. But then when he was listening to the sort of music that was coming out of the record labels and finding themselves on the radio, there was a disconnect. He felt that this wasn't authentically documenting what was in the clubs. So then he sought out to do exactly that, and his first record was just that. It had more of the kind of scratches that would be performed live. It had a kind of reduced tone to it. It didn't sound like R&B, which was really another genre. It was something new and unique in itself. And that all came from his pursuit of trying to understand and document what he loved. Because it's by trying to document that you're going to better understand it. And it's the pursuit that fills it with emotion. And so ultimately, what gave hip-hop its kind of mainstream stance was this passion-led, authentic approach, this documentation of what was already powerful and palpable. This is an approach that seems to really have great effect. And a person that I think captures this idea best is that of the psychologist Carl Rogers, who once beautifully articulated what is most personal is most universal. This idea that if we're trying to create something mainstream or we think will have impact by kind of generally approaching it, we never really quite hit the mark. In fact, we don't have the depth that's needed that comes really from exploring something with passion and excitement and something that feels more personally unique to you. This is the ethos of much of Rick Rubin's work throughout his career, but is also something we can take away for our own work. This idea that actually if we lead with passion, you know, people can't help but be drawn to passion. There's something very life-affirming to that pursuit when we see it. But how do we actually measure the impact of our work once we've found a way to create something that might be emotionally resonant? Well, this is where I would say don't look at the width or the breadth with which you've had impact, but rather look at the depth. That's the thing that's important here. And a great metric for this would be to look at how sad people are when they've finished with the work. Again, going back to that interview between Lex Friedman and Dan Houser, Lex Friedman talked about how the works of GTA and Red Dead Redemption usually left him feeling sad that it was over whenever he came to complete the game. And he notes this because that's really the impact the game left with him. The exploration he got to have, the freedom, the openness, but really the emotional connection that was earned through that exploration, through the story, through the characters. These were the things that left an impact on him, and he was sad to see them go as it ended. And I think the insight for this all sits on something we can all evidence and watch, which is how people keep returning to the same albums to re-listen to them over and over again, or they re-watch the same shows, or they re-watch the same films, reread the same books. This is because we keep returning, not because of the intricacies of the story or the techniques in which these ideas were explored, but rather because of the feeling that we once felt and the desire to re-feel them again. And to me, that's the goal we should strive for when we create what we create.